So President Trump dropped a bombshell today when he was at the airport in Palm Beach getting on the plane, where he was elaborating on a tweet that he put out, a Truth Social post, I should say, that he put out about how there are negotiations going on to end the war with Iran. We're going to get into all of that. And there's a lot of very important information in this to understand what to expect in the coming days. So stick with me to the end. We're going to drill down on who Trump may be talking to and what that might mean for what kind of regime change we could be headed for. So this is an important video. Before we get to everything, please make sure to once again go visit Israel365charity.com, Israel365charity.com, and please click on the Israel is Under Fire banner at the top of the page, or scroll down to the current projects to Israel is at War, help now. And there you could help us provide for families that are struggling with a whole range of issues as a result of the ballistic missile attacks, the missile attacks that Israel's undergoing from Lebanon, from Iran, lots of families with lots of needs. And Israel 365 is plugged in with a lot of great charities on the ground, especially with the holiday of Passover coming up at the end of next week. There's added needs at home. And this is your way to participate right here on the ground with the needy in Israel at a time of crisis. So please, please head over to Israel365charity.com and drop a couple nickels in the bucket for that. Now, Trump tweeted out the following. This is earlier today, this morning, before he went to the airport. He posted the following truth post. I am pleased to report that the United States of America and the country of Iran, very interesting, have had over the last 2 days very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East. Based on the tenor and tone of these in-depth, detailed, and constructive conversations, which will continue throughout the week, I have instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period, subject to the success of the ongoing meetings and discussions. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. Okay, background. You're probably aware that 2 days ago, on Saturday, Trump made he gave an ultimatum, a 48-hour ultimatum that the Straits of Hormuz must be opened, or the United States will strike the leading energy plant in Iran. Now, the Israelis are operating in Iran. They're operating on the ground there, meaning they're focused on degrading the Basij and the IRGC to bring about regime change and to also take out a lot of the military, whatever's left of the military industry and infrastructure that's there, right? We know what the Israelis are doing, while the Americans are focused in the Straits of Hormuz and Karg Island and all the stuff going on in the Persian Gulf. That's kind of the division of responsibility right now. And Trump now is threatening, in order to open up the Straits of Hormuz, to open up the Persian Gulf, to destroy Iranian power plants. That's what he did 2 days ago. But what I'm hearing is that there were a lot of countries, and even the Israelis, who turned to him and said, that's a bad idea for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Israelis are operating on the ground, and they need the electricity to be up so that whatever cell phones and sources of information and their informers on the ground can continue to communicate with them. It would also turn a percentage, we don't know how big a percentage, but doing such a thing would turn a percentage of the Iranian people against the Americans for attacking, for making their lives more miserable, for cutting off the electricity. So it could backfire in a number of ways. So it could be that Trump was looking for an off-ramp to be able to delay that ultimatum by longer, and saying that he's going to postpone strikes on Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period. Maybe that's what this is all about. But he's saying that they're having very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of the hostilities in the Middle East. So that's the post that he put up. And then at the airport in Palm Beach, he spoke to the media. And I'm going to play you 3 different clips from that same press gaggle where he dealt with this, because in between he dealt with a whole range of other issues, domestic issues, other things. So here's clip 1.
Who is Steve Witkoff speaking with, Mr. President? A top person, don't forget. We've wiped out the leadership phase 1, phase 2, and largely phase 3. But we're dealing with the man who I believe is the most respected and the leader. It's a little tough. We've wiped out everybody.
Is that the Supreme Leader?
No, not the Supreme Leader.
So
We don't.
not much talk.
Well, nobody heard of the second Supreme Leader, the son.
Are these direct?
We have not heard from the son. Every once in a while you see a statement made, but we haven't. We don't know if he's living. But the people that seem to be running it, and they seem that based on really fact, because things they've said have taken place.
Mr. President,
Again,
Mr. President, I know you deployed.
I don't want him to be killed. Okay, I don't want him to be killed.
Mr. President, you deployed.
Nobody wants to be that. Nobody wants that job right now. Nobody's exactly looking forward to being the head of that particular country. But perhaps we'll be able to solve that problem.
Okay. Two huge items, bombshells, that were in that one statement. Number one, President Trump said that he's talking to who they believe is the top person. The person really making decisions. He was then asked who might that be? And he said, I don't want to tell you because I don't want the person to be killed. Now, think about that. The Israelis are killing all the leaders in Iran. That's as I laid out, that's what they're busy with. He's saying that he's talking to this guy, and if he divulges his name, the guy could be killed. He doesn't want him to become a target. What is this signal? Is it possible? I'm throwing out this possibility that this signals that the Americans and the Israelis aren't entirely on the same page when it comes to the remaining Iranian leadership. I'm going to come back to that point later on in this video when we have a little bit more information to work with. Okay, but I'm just throwing that out there. That was a huge bombshell that he put out there. And also when he's talking about how this is a top person because the things that this person says will happen or will be done happen, which means that he's actually calling the shots, means we're talking about someone that must be, fairly well known. And in fact, there was a leak, which I'm going to share with you in a moment, about who it is they're talking to. Okay, so he says they're talking to this top person, and that he doesn't want the person to be killed. Okay, those are the two big takeaways there. But let's look at this next clip. Okay, this is from the same press gaggle.
Look, and there'll also be a form of a very serious form of a regime change. Now, in all fairness, everybody's been killed from the regime. They're really starting off. There's automatically a regime change. But we're dealing with some people that I find to be very reasonable, very solid. The people within know who they are. They're very respected. And maybe one of them will be exactly what we're looking for. Look at Venezuela, how well that's working out. We are doing so well in Venezuela with oil and with the relationship between the president-elect and us. And maybe we find somebody like that in Iran.
Okay. This is absolutely massive. And if you've been watching my videos since the beginning of the war, or even from before the war, you've been tracking this particular story, which is Trump touting the Venezuela model for Iran. What's the Venezuela model? I mean, see what happened here. He says, most of the leadership's been killed. There's almost no one left. We're talking to a few of the people who are left. Look how great Venezuela is. Maybe we'll find someone like that here because, that's the result that they want in Iran. Okay, let's talk about the Venezuela model. Venezuela was a model of regime change, and Trump talked about this in the first week of the war when he had a press conference with German Chancellor Merz in the Oval Office. He had a press gaggle, and he was asked about regime change in Iran. And that was the first time he brought up Venezuela as the model for what they're looking for. And there he drilled down a little bit more. And what he said, he talked about what was so good about the Venezuela model. He contrasted it with what happened in Iraq. And he said, in Venezuela, we took out Maduro, we took out the top guy, and we then started working with the number two. That's what they did. They took out Maduro, and then they immediately empowered the new president, they call her, Delcy Rodriguez. Delcy Rodriguez was the partner in crime of Maduro in Venezuela. She's the biggest mobster and murderer in the country. Okay, so what Trump was saying was, we kept it intact. We kept everything intact, and that means that everything continues to run. The trains run, the city services, whatever it is. Meaning the government can continue to run because you're working with basically the existing regime, but holding a gun to their heads, and they have to answer to the United States. And he was touting that as a successful regime change. And there's something to be said for it. There's something to be said for it because you prevent chaos. You prevent it from devolving into violence and chaos. And the people running the show stay running the show. It also means that there's an incentive for people in the regime to stop fighting if they know that they're not all just going to get killed, but if they play ball, they could survive. You encourage defections. You encourage people to cooperate rather than fight to the death. Because if the only option is that they're going to be killed, they're going to fight to the death. So there's something to be said for this. Again, the main thing is that it prevents chaos and it keeps things running. And Trump thinks that this is a great success. What's the problem with it? The problem with it is that in Venezuela, there was a democratic election. Maria Corina Machado won it in a landslide. But immediately, Maduro canceled the election results, claimed he won, started hunting his opposition. And the Venezuelan people who were hoping to gain their freedom through that election are still living under the same regime, basically. They're not as oppressed because the Americans are kind of sitting over it. But the Venezuela story is not over. If that country does not eventually move towards actual democratic elections, and the Trump administration just empowers Delcy Rodriguez and her ruling junta to continue to run Venezuela, then the Venezuelan people are no freer. And it's not really regime change. The other problem is that you can't import that model to Iran, because in Iran, you're dealing with ideologues, with these Shiite apocalyptic ideologues who are not Marxist drug lords in Venezuela, or the type of people who were running the dictatorship in Venezuela are, they're communists, they're Marxists, they're thugs. But that's different when the thugs are also radical Shiite fanatics. Okay, so that's one reason it won't work. There's other reasons it won't necessarily work. But if Trump is going after the Venezuela model, well, that's very interesting. Okay, so let's pay attention to what he says in the next clip we're going to look at here. Here's the third clip, clip 3.
In all fairness, everybody's been killed from the regime. They're really starting off. There's automatically a regime change. But we're dealing with some people that I find to be very reasonable, very solid. The people within know who they are. They're very respected. And maybe one of them will be exactly what we're looking for. Look at Venezuela.
So that's the same clip. That's the same clip where he talks about looking at Venezuela. Okay. He says they're very reasonable. They're very solid, right? I think he was actually repeating it again. He was coming back to the same idea. Now, who exactly are they talking about? So the Jerusalem Post, Amichai Stein of the Jerusalem Post, broke this story a couple hours ago. U.S. is holding talks with Iranian parliament speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Okay, and this is the main reason that I really wanted to make this video, is to explain to you who this guy is. Because as you follow this war, as you start watching the news and everything that's going to happen in the next few days and weeks, we might be hearing this guy's name again. If the Americans are actually negotiating, if this is correct, and I don't think that the Jerusalem Post would report it if it weren't, the New York Post picked it up as well, that they're negotiating with Ghalibaf, with Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Speaker of the Iranian parliament, then you're going to hear his name a lot. And what it also means is that the Americans will have an interest in presenting him as a moderate. Okay. and saying that he's someone reasonable that we can work with. You notice how Trump was talking. There's people that are very reasonable. What does he mean by reasonable? If he viewed Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's number 2, as reasonable, reasonable might just mean it's someone I can do business with. It doesn't mean that they're someone who is a good person in any way. But who is Ghalibaf? Okay, so here's Ghalibaf's picture. This is Ghalibaf. You might have seen him, Speaker of the House. But let's understand who he is, because this is going to become relevant in the coming days. Let me explain to you who Ghalibaf really is. Again, the way he's presented in the media is wrong. He's called Speaker of the Parliament, senior Iranian leader. The easiest way to understand Ghalibaf is to just look at his career. He himself has openly described riding around on a motorcycle during protests with a club in his hand, beating demonstrators proudly. He didn't deny it. He didn't walk it back. He proudly talks about that. That's where he comes from. He rose up through the ranks of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, which is the core institution of the regime. That is the regime. And from early on, his job, listen to what his job was. He's Speaker of the House. That doesn't mean he was an elected official, a normal elected official, not someone who came out of the business world and ran for office. Let me explain who he was. His job from early on in the IRGC was dealing with protesters. In 1999, there were mass student protests against the regime. He was already in a senior role at that point. The military leadership made it clear that if the protests weren't crushed, they would step in directly. Right? The authority sat with the security apparatus, and he was the guy who was calling. He was calling for brutal crackdown of the protesters, and they opened fire. They killed a lot of protesters then in 1999 because Ghalibaf insisted. What he basically said to Ali Khamenei at the time was that if you don't suppress these protests brutally, if we don't fire on the protesters, I'm going to stage a military coup and take you down. Okay? A few years later, Ghalibaf became the police chief. Okay? Protesters being shot by the police, okay, raiding student dormitories. In 2009, during the Green Movement protests, that's another big wave of pro-democracy protests, pro-liberty and freedom protests. He was the mayor of Tehran, also responsible in large part for the local police suppressing those protests. Okay, and he speaks about his role in suppressing protests as an achievement, okay? Because that's how he advanced. He advanced in the system by demonstrating that he could suppress protests, his effectiveness in restoring control. In the most recent protests, the ones in January, he was part of the leadership authorizing the slaughter of tens of thousands of Iranians. Okay? That's who Ghalibaf is. Every stage of his career, his entire ascension to power was by brutally suppressing and murdering protesters. That's who he is. He was the main driver behind the slaughter of the protesters. And here's the key. The Iranian people know this. From the perspective of the Iranian people who are oppressed by this regime, who've been slaughtered in the streets, who are praying for the day that they can overthrow it, those Iranian people, those tens of millions of Iranian people, they know who the worst actors are in the leadership, in the power structure. Ghalibaf is like the butcher. He's like the worst of them. He's the worst of the worst. They all know this. They all see him. He's like the brutal murderer that they all fear. If the United States actually negotiates with this guy, okay? If the United States is negotiating with this guy, if Trump tries to pull a Venezuela with this guy, who is the most, and it makes sense, by the way, that the Jerusalem Post reported that, because Trump said he's dealing with probably the top guy. Like, so you have to think, who are the remaining top leaders who are still making decisions? Masoud Pezeshkian, the president, is not really powerful, and he's been sidelined, and he's an actual moderate. But Ghalibaf, this guy, is actually very powerful, and that's why he was saying that. The reason I played you that first clip where he said that the way they know that the person they're dealing with is the right person is that the things he says happen. Masoud Pezeshkian, the president, early on in the war, you might remember, he said that Iran would no longer attack its neighbors. And the IRGC contradicted him and shot him down, and he had to walk it back. And then he tried to resign, meaning the things that he says should happen don't happen. The IRGC, Ghalibaf is the guy. He is pure IRGC. That's how he rose to his position of power. That's who he is. And he's all about suppressing protests. He's the radical of the radicals. And he's all about brutally suppressing the protesters. And if the United States tries to pull a Venezuela and says that he's a moderate and that he's not really a mullah and he's more secular and he's going to run things, what you're going to have is a brutal military dictator. And the Americans might try to sell it to the world as regime change. Maybe they'll back off on some of the Islam stuff, but they'll still repress their people and oppress them and murder them. And the Iranian people won't have any of it because they're going to feel incredibly betrayed, because they're going to see the Americans cutting a deal with the butcher, like the worst, like the poster boy for everything that is brutal about the regime. And what's more, the Israelis are probably not going to stand for it. I mentioned in that first clip that Trump said he didn't want to reveal the identity of the person because he didn't want him to be killed. Who would kill him? Oh, the Israelis. Well, can't Trump just tell the Israelis not to kill the guy that they're negotiating with? What this signals is a possibility that the Israelis and the Americans are not on the same page, and that the Americans want a Venezuela model and the Israelis do not. The Israelis know that that won't work in Iran because you can't do the Venezuela model with a regime that is led by fanatical Shiites who want an apocalypse. If you don't know what I'm talking about by wanting an apocalypse, go to the Israel 365 News YouTube channel and find the video of an interview I did with Dr. Mordechai Kedar about the belief system of the Shiites who run Iran. They actually want to bring an apocalypse. And that's what this guy Ghalibaf is. He is the guy. He is the brutal butcher of the regime. And what's more, because the Israelis won't stand for it, and because of what his ideology is, the necessity to go back into Iran, either the Israelis going back or America going back, and more terrorism, and you want a forever war? Forever war you can guarantee a forever war if you keep Ghalibaf in power, because maybe short term you'll have stability a la Venezuela, but what you'll have is more unrest from the people, more terrorism, more brutality. The Israelis are not going to stand for it. And it means that the war is going to drag on and on and on. So what might look like a short-term, an end to the war because you found someone who's a strongman. Trump likes strongmen, right? He empowered a Shara in Syria, who was also a terrorist. And if Trump is looking for the Venezuela model with this guy Ghalibaf, this is not what we have in mind. Now, all of that said, let's go back to what I said at the very beginning, that Trump was looking for an off-ramp because he threatened to destroy the energy facilities. I can't imagine, with the way Trump has been talking since the very beginning, especially since the actual kinetic war started, I can't imagine that Trump is going to fall for a kind of fake regime change. He's made it very clear over the last few weeks that he talking about how previous presidents didn't really deal with the problem and he's dealing with it. I can't imagine that he's going to let this thing end without the regime actually being removed. And cutting a deal with Ghalibaf is literally keeping the regime in power. What's more, it's going to signal to all of the remaining IRGC and Basij guys and the network of Iranian operatives in South America and the drug traffickers and that whole apparatus. It's going to signal to all of them that they won. Because remember what I've been saying all along, the definition of victory for the regime is simply that the regime doesn't fall. And even if the Americans try to tell the world that the regime fell, if Ghalibaf is the guy who remains in power, everyone really knows, especially everyone in Iran and the whole apparatus of this regime knows that they didn't really fall because that is the regime. So this is worrisome. But again, Trump is, and I keep saying this, he deliberately does not telegraph what he's doing. So we don't know what he actually has in mind and what's going to happen with these negotiations, if they're real or not. But, I guess we'll see in the coming days. But important takeaway for you, and this is why I wanted to make this video, to give you this information, is that if this is where we're moving, if we're going to start hearing this name, Ghalibaf, and you're going to see this guy's face, who is this guy they're talking to? Who is this guy? This is the person the Americans are talking to. If you're going to hear this, now you have the information, you know who it is, and understand that the Iranian people are not going to stand for this. So it's not going to, the only way that empowering Ghalibaf would mean that the Iranian people, that there's no regime change and the Iranian people are going to sit back and do nothing, is because they'll be so terrified to go into the streets because they'll certainly be killed if Ghalibaf is in charge. So yeah, this is, we'll be watching this, and I'll keep you updated on developments as they come. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for help growing the channel, and thank you for the comments. I'm reading a lot of them, some helpful ones. Someone told me I get too repetitive, which I agree with, but I do it kind of deliberately. I sometimes feel that you have to explain things a few different ways to make sure that people really get them, but sometimes I do get a little too repetitive. So please continue to give me the constructive criticism. I really, truly appreciate it. God bless you all.